My family cut me out of the will. You don't deserve anything. Grandma's diary held $1 million secret. Did you really expect more? My mother needed to secure the family's future, not waste her fortune on someone who chose to be a librarian. My Uncle Richard's words cut through the lawyer's office like a sharp knife. His tone oozed the same contempt he'd always had for my career choice. Around me, the luxurious Charleston law office suddenly felt too small, suffocating. The family lawyer, a middle-aged man with an unreadable expression, just watched, as if scenes like this were routine during will readings. My name is Emma Morgan. I'm 32, and I just found out that 5 years of dedicating my life to caring for my grandmother were worth, in her eyes, nothing more than a collection of old books and a chest of diaries. Everything else. The Victorian house where I spent countless afternoons reading to her when her eyesight began to fail, the few but valuable family heirlooms, and any money, all went to my Uncle Richard and his children, Nathan and Olivia. Sweetheart, you could sell those old books online, maybe cover a month's rent, suggested my Aunt Victoria, Richard's wife, with a smile that never reached her cold eyes. She adjusted her pearl necklace, real pearls, of course, as if just speaking to me made her need to reaffirm her social status. I looked over at my cousins. Nathan, 35, a corporate lawyer like his father, was impatiently checking his Rolex, probably running late for some important meeting. Olivia, 33, a digital influencer with over 1 million followers, barely lifted her eyes from her phone as she typed furiously, likely posting about her deep sadness over Grandma's passing, using the perfect filter to look appropriately, somber. When do I need to empty the house? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. You have 2 weeks, Nathan finally answered, slipping his watch back on. The demolition crew comes after that to prep the property for the new owner. Demolition crew? They're tearing down the house? The question escaped before I could stop it. That Victorian house had been Grandma Nora's home for over 50 years. Every creaky floorboard told a story. It's real estate, Emma, Olivia said, finally bothering to look at me. The land is worth more than that old house. The developer's going to build luxury condos, prime location. She said that last part like she was promoting it in one of her videos. Richard straightened his silk tie. My mother was always too sentimental about that house. Now we can finally realize its true value. True value. As if all the years of memories, the birthday parties in the rose garden, the afternoons reading on the porch, the stories shared by the fireplace meant nothing compared to square footage in an up-and-coming neighborhood. As I left the office, the Charleston sun felt strangely bright for a day when I felt so empty inside. It wasn't the material things that mattered to me. What hurt was the symbolism, as if the 5 years I had given up my promising career in New York to come care for Grandma were worth less than the rare holiday visits my uncle and cousins squeezed in, always rushing to leave. I drove to Grandma's house, no, Richard's house now. With tears blurring my vision, the light blue Victorian structure with white trim appeared as grand and welcoming as ever. For the next 14 days, it would be my task to pack up decades of accumulated life, boxing up the only things that now belonged to me: books, diaries, and memories. That night, alone in the house that would soon be gone, I began methodically cataloging Grandma's books. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. As a librarian, I couldn't just throw them in boxes. Each volume deserved respect. They had been her silent companions for a lifetime. Grandma's personal library filled 2 entire walls of her second-floor study. Thousands of volumes, from worn-out classics to carefully preserved first editions. I knew that collection well. How many afternoons had we spent discussing Austen, Wolfe Morrison, and so many others? Around midnight, I reached a shelf of 20th century American literature. That's when I noticed something odd. a book that seemed out of place. The spine read, Traditional Southern Cooking, but it was sitting among fiction. Curious, I pulled it out. It wasn't a cookbook. The spine was fake, an old trick I recognized from my studies in literary preservation. Inside was a faded red leather journal, its pages yellowed with time. I opened it carefully and immediately recognized Grandma's elegant handwriting, dated 1950. April 12th, 1952. The manuscript is complete. 3 years of late nights, of hopes and doubts poured onto paper. I took it to 3 publishers this week. The first didn't even open the envelope when they saw it was written by a woman. The second suggested I submit to women's magazines with lighter little stories. The third was at least honest. This is brilliant, but no one will buy serious literature written by an unknown woman. My heart raced. Grandma Nora, ACE writer? She had never mentioned that in all our countless conversations about literature. I sat down in her old reading armchair, turned on the green-shaded lamp that had so often illuminated our reading sessions, and kept reading. April 18th, 1952. I visited Thomas at the bookstore today. I showed him the rejection letters. He read my manuscript last month and was outraged. "It's the best thing I've read in years, Nora," he said. "The problem isn't your writing. It's your name." I think he's right, but what can I do? Change my name. I turned the page, completely absorbed. April 25th, 1952. TB suggested a solution that seemed absurd to me at first. "Use my initials reversed," he said. T.S. Morgan. Sounds like a man. No one will question it. I refused immediately. It's my story, my soul on paper. He smiled, that gentle way of his. "What matters more, Nora? Your name on the cover or your words being read?" TB. Could that be Thomas Bennett, the old bookseller who sometimes visited Grandma? And T.S. Morgan. The name felt vaguely familiar, like something I should recognize. May Tech, 1952. Thomas sent the manuscript to his friend at Horizon Press, signed as T.S. Morgan. I wait anxiously, though I've told myself not to get my hopes up. This small town isn't a place for dreams too big. May 15th, 1952. A letter arrived. Today, they want to publish the book. Publish my book. When I read the letter, my legs gave out. Thank God Thomas was with me, or I would have fainted right there in the kitchen. They offered an advance. Not much, but it's real. My book will be real. I kept reading, fascinated until dawn. The journal ended with an entry that gave me chills. June 10th, 1952. I made the decision today. TB says it's the only way. No one will ever know, but at least the words will live. If the truth ever comes to light, let it be when the world is ready, or when someone who truly understands the value of stories uncovers my secret. I signed the contract as T.S. Morgan. From now on, I will live 2 lives. Nora Morgan, the literature teacher, and T.S. Morgan, the reclusive author. May God forgive me for this necessary lie. I closed the journal, my mind swirling with questions. I had to talk to Thomas Bennett. The next morning, instead of continuing to pack, I went straight to Ponce Bennett's Books, a little corner bookstore in Charleston's historic downtown that had been there for over 50 years. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered. The smell of old books and polished wood wrapped around me like a warm embrace. Thomas Bennett, 78 years old, stood behind the counter organizing a stack of first editions. His white hair contrasted with his neatly pressed navy blue shirt, and his kind eyes, behind old-fashioned glasses, lit up when he saw me. "Emma," he smiled, though there was sadness in his gaze. "I'm so sorry about your grandmother. Nora was extraordinary." "Thomas," I said, cutting straight to the point, We need to talk. I placed the journal on the counter. Who is T.S. Morgan? The old bookseller visibly paled. His knotted fingers, stiff with arthritis, trembled slightly as he picked up the journal. He glanced around the empty store before speaking. Where did you find this? He asked in a hushed voice. In Grandma's library, hidden in a fake book spine. He flipped through a few pages of the journal, his eyes glistening as he read fragments. Then he looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing something important. She finally wanted you to know, he murmured, more to himself than to me. After a pause, he added, Look for the book with the golden bird on the spine, on the third shelf in her study. Then come back here. We'll have a lot to talk about. I returned to Grandma's house, my heart pounding. In the study, I carefully examined the third shelf. There it was, a dark blue hardcover book with a delicate golden bird on the spine. The Silences of the River, by T.S. Morgan, published in 1954. The cover showed a winding river at dusk. With trembling hands, I opened the book. The copyright page confirmed it. T.S. Morgan, rights managed by Stevenson Thomas Bennett. Stevenson Thomas. St. reversed becomes T.S. Memories of my American literature classes in college rushed back. T.S. Morgan, now I remembered perfectly. An enigmatic author who had published a single novel in the early 50s, but had influenced an entire generation of writers. His innovative style, blending poetic realism with psychological suspense, had been groundbreaking. A recluse who never appeared in public, but whose occasional short stories in literary magazines were eagerly awaited by critics and readers alike. I sat in Grandma's chair, stunned by the realization. I leafed through the yellowed pages, reading passages that now seemed to pulse with new life. On the acknowledgments page, a simple line. For N, whose light guides the way, N for Nora. The thought seemed both absurd and perfectly logical. Grandma Nora, the gentle literature teacher who spent hours discussing books with me, was actually T.S. Morgan? The same T.S. Morgan whose work I had studied at university? I ran back to the bookstore, clutching the book to my chest like a precious treasure. It was her, wasn't it? I asked as soon as I walked in. Grandma was T.S. Morgan. Thomas let out a deep sigh and closed the bookstore door, flipping the sign to closed. Your grandmother was the most brilliant person I ever met, Thomas began, guiding me to the back of the bookstore, a cozy space with worn-out armchairs and a small table where an old kettle was waiting. We met in 1950 at the old municipal library. I was a young, aspiring editor, fresh out of New York, and she was a teacher with ideas that went far beyond the limits of this town. He made tea for both of us. Earl Grey. Grandma's favorite. His hands, though trembling, moved with the precision of someone who had performed the same ritual for decades. When she showed me the manuscript of The Silences of the River, I was stunned. It was unlike anything I had ever read. The story of a small riverside community, its complexities, secrets, the way the past always returns like the tide, but with a unique, almost hypnotic style. He smiled at the memory. But in 1952, the world wasn't ready to accept that such a work came from a woman in a small town, especially a work that defied literary conventions. So you created T.S. Morgan, I concluded. It was a simple agreement at first, Thomas continued. I would act as the intermediary, the public face when needed, which was rare since we carefully cultivated a reclusive reputation. My friend at Horizon Press knew the truth but kept the secret. The plan was to reveal the truth a few years later, once she had gained enough recognition, but that never happened. Thomas shook his head, his gaze distant. Nora feared the scandal in our conservative community, the possibility of losing her job as a teacher, which she loved. And then the years went by. The success grew beyond what we had ever imagined. The The Silences of the River made it into university curricula. Critics wrote dissertations about the mysterious T.S. Morgan. The secret became part of our lives. Did she keep writing? Oh yes, mostly short stories for literary magazines, some under the same pseudonym, others she never published, always working in the early hours of the morning or late at night, fitting her secret art between classes and later, taking care of her father when he fell ill. Why did she never tell me? We spent so many nights talking about books. She knew I studied literature. Thomas smiled gently. She wanted to, Emma. In her later years, she mentioned several times that she was preparing something for you to discover. She said you had the eyes of a true reader, someone who sees beyond the words on the page. I think she wanted you to find it on your own, like a final literary adventure between you two. Tears burned my eyes. It was so typical of Grandma, to turn even her greatest revelation into a story for me to unravel. Are there more journals? Many, I imagine. Nora was meticulous in documenting her creative process. And letters too. We exchanged hundreds over the years, discussing revisions, ideas for new stories, critics' reactions. In the days that followed, I found 5 more journals, each carefully hidden inside different books in Grandma's library. Inside, Jane Eyre, Mrs. Dalloway, The Second Sex, 100 Years of Solitude, and The Color Purple. All novels we had intensely discussed during our reading sessions. The journals revealed an extraordinary secret life. Nora Morgan, the gentle literature teacher, secretly creating works that inspired other writers, that were studied in universities across the country, that had become modern classics. They documented her fears, her doubts, her frustration with the persistent sexism in the literary world, even decades after her debut. One particular entry from 1979 deeply touched me. Today, a young student asked me why there weren't more women in the American literature curriculum. I suggested she read T.S. Morgan. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. Sometimes I think about revealing the truth, but then I see how critics still debate whether women can write serious literature. Now, maybe when Emma is grown, the world will be different. I brought my discoveries to Dr. Sarah Chen, a scholar specializing in 20th century women's literature who taught at the University of Charleston. At 45, she was known for her work uncovering forgotten female voices in literary history. Her university office was exactly as I had imagined, walls covered with books from floor to ceiling, an old desk overloaded with papers, and a window overlooking the ancient oak in the center of campus. "This is revolutionary," she declared after analyzing the materials for hours. She adjusted her red-rimmed glasses, leaning over one of the journals. "The stylistic analysis confirms it. Your grandmother definitely wrote the works attributed to T.S. Morgan. The notes on revisions, her documented creative process, everything matches perfectly with the published texts." She pulled a worn copy of The Silences of the River from her shelf. "I've used this book in my post-war American narratives course for years. Critics have always debated how an apparently male author could so sensitively capture women's experiences and voices." She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, now we know why." "What does this mean, academically speaking?" I asked. "It means we'll need to rewrite entire chapters of American literary history," Sarah replied, her eyes glowing with academic excitement. T.S. Morgan is studied as one of the innovators who challenged the male-dominated narrative conventions of the 1950s, discovering that it was actually a woman forced to hide her identity. That's a revelation that resonates not only with the past, but with our present. The question is, I hesitated, how do we prove this to the world? All I have are the journals and Thomas's testimony. "This," Sarah smiled, picking up one of the journals, "is more than enough to start a full academic investigation. We can conduct comparative stylistic analyses, examine correspondence, interview people who knew your grandmother. Truth has a weight of its own, Emma. Once it's revealed, it finds its way. What if my family tries to stop it? Sarah's smile faded. Why would they do that? Because it doesn't fit the image they've built of her. A modest schoolteacher with no greater ambitions. I'm afraid they'll see this as a stain. A stain? Finding out that your mother or grandmother is one of the most influential writers of the 20th century? She looked genuinely puzzled. That's an extraordinary legacy. I sighed. You don't know my family. Naively, I thought my family would be as amazed as I was by the discovery. The next night, I arranged a dinner at Grandma's house, while it was still technically mine to use, and invited Richard, Victoria, Nathan, and Olivia. I set the dining table carefully, laying out the journals, the book, and Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis in a neat display. They arrived on time, though clearly annoyed to be there. Victoria wrinkled her nose as she walked in, as if the air in the house had somehow become less refined since it passed into family ownership. What's all this mystery about, Emma? Richard asked, not even bothering to take off his coat. Some of us have other engagements tonight. I have something important to show you, I replied, leading them to the dining room. Something I discovered about Grandma Nora. I explained what I had found, showing them the journals, the book, and the analysis. I talked about T.S. Morgan, about the literary significance, about how it changed everything we thought we knew about Grandma. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then Richard started to laugh, that condescending laugh I knew all too well. A conspiracy theory? He shook his head. Emma, I've always known you had a vivid imagination, but this is ridiculous. It's not a theory. Uncle Richard, these are facts, concrete evidence. Dr. Chen from the university confirmed. Your grandmother was an elementary school teacher, dear. Victoria interrupted condescendingly. Perfectly respectable, but to claim she was a secret revolutionary author? Please. Nathan flipped through one of the journals with clinical disinterest. Journals can be easily forged, and even if they're real, fantasizing about being a famous writer isn't exactly unusual. They're not fantasies. They're detailed notes of her creative process, matching the published book exactly. You're clearly trying to make yourself feel important after being cut out of the will, Nathan accused, snapping the journal shut. As a lawyer, I should warn you that we could sue for defamation if you go public with these delusions. Defamation? How could revealing that Grandma was a brilliant writer possibly be defamation? We're talking about the reputation of a respected educator, Richard replied, suggesting she lived a double life, deceiving everyone, publishing under a male pseudonym. That tarnishes her memory. Or maybe, I said, anger rising in my voice. It shows how extraordinary she really was, living in a world that wouldn't let a woman like her shine under her own name. Olivia, who had stayed silent until then, finally spoke. I think the story is fascinating, even if it's just that, a story. Her tone was gentler than the others. But Dad is right, Emma. This could complicate the sale of the property, raise questions about intellectual property. It might be better to let the past rest. I observed them, a cold sensation of understanding settling in. It wasn't about Grandma's reputation. It was about money. If T.S. Morgan were revealed as Nora Morgan, there would be questions about royalties, copyrights, the value of the literary estate, complications that could delay or jeopardize their inheritance plans. I left that meeting not only hurt, but also deeply concerned. The next day, I received a formal notice via email. The sale of the house had been expedited, and I had only 48 hours to remove Nora's remaining belongings before they were either discarded or deemed abandoned. Panicked, I called Thomas. Together, We spent the night in Grandma's office, frantically searching for any additional evidence that could confirm her secret identity and protect her literary legacy. There must be more, Thomas insisted, scanning every book on the shelf. Nora was always meticulous, always thinking several steps ahead. That was when I noticed something odd about the old oak desk. A slightly asymmetrical pattern on the side panel. Thomas recognized it immediately. A hidden compartment, he murmured. Common in desks from that era, but most have been forgotten or sealed over the years. We worked together, pressing different points until we heard a soft click. The panel slid open, revealing a concealed space. Inside, there was a sealed envelope with my name written in Nora's unmistakable handwriting. For my Emma when the time comes. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, you have discovered my most well-kept secret. Yes, I am, or was, T.S. Morgan. A name I invented so I could share my stories with the world when the world wasn't ready to hear them from a woman like me. Thomas was my accomplice, my protector, and my dearest friend throughout this journey. Without him, my words would never have found their readers. You must be wondering why I never told you. Perhaps out of fear, or maybe out of habit after so many decades of secrecy. Or perhaps, selfishly, I wanted my favorite granddaughter to have this last literary adventure, uncovering the mystery just as we always did with the books we loved together. There's something else you need to know. I never spent a single cent from my book earnings. My teacher's salary was enough for my simple needs. Instead, every dollar was deposited into an account that very few people know exists, managed by a literary foundation. All the details are here, along with the original contracts signed over the past decades. As my literary heir, the sole person to whom I bequeathed my diaries and manuscripts, you have the legal right not only to the truth, but also to the wealth that my words have generated over the years. I didn't do this for money, my dear. I did it for the love of stories and the truths they can reveal. And now, I leave it to you to decide how to share this truth with the world. With all my love, your Grandma Nora, also known as T.S. Morgan. Alongside the letter were legal documents, aged publishing contracts, and detailed information about a bank account under the Pau Horizon Literary Foundation, established in 1954. The most recent statements displayed a balance that made me gasp. 5,347,890.62. More than $5 million. In accumulated royalties from a book that had never gone out of print and short stories that were regularly republished and studied. More than the house and all of Nora's other assets combined. My God, Thomas whispered, looking over my shoulder. I knew there were substantial royalties, but I never imagined. She really never touched the money. There was another document, a detailed map of a Charleston, with several properties marked in red, including Thomas's bookstore and other historic buildings in the neighborhood. What is this? I asked. Thomas examined the map, his expression shifting from shock to admiration. These are all historic properties that were at risk of demolition over the years. This one here was almost turned into a parking lot in 1962. This other one nearly became a shopping center in the 70s. He looked at me, a newfound understanding in his eyes. She bought them, all of them, discreetly, through the foundation. Nora's genius plan became clear. She hadn't just accumulated wealth. She had strategically invested it to preserve the historic character of the neighborhood she loved, preventing developers from transforming it. Including your bookstore? I asked. Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I knew the owner had sold it to an anonymous investor when I couldn't secure the financing to buy the property. I hired a lawyer specializing in literary rights, who confirmed, as the legal heir to Nora's diaries, manuscripts, and the literary identity of Tenkusi. S. Morgan. I had full rights to the royalties and future control of her works. Additionally, Nora's will, which explicitly left me her diaries and manuscripts, constituted a legal transfer of intellectual property rights. It's an extraordinary case, explained the lawyer, a middle-aged man specializing in literary estates. But legally solid. Your grandmother planned this meticulously. 2 days later, when Richard and his family arrived to oversee the final removal of Nora's belongings, they found not only me, but also Thomas, Dr. Chen, and my literary attorney waiting in the living room. What is this? An intervention? Richard scoffed, pulling off his expensive leather gloves. Your time's up, Emma. The demolition crew starts tomorrow. I'm aware, I replied calmly. I just thought you all should know the truth before we finalize Grandma Nora's affairs. Victoria sighed dramatically. Still with that ridiculous story about your grandmother being a secret writer? I thought we had settled this. Actually, Dr. Chen interjected, stepping forward with a folder of documents. I've completed my comparative literary analysis. The stylistic verification, the linguistic patterns, the revision notes in her journals that match exactly the changes in the published versions. Everything confirms, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Nora Morgan was T.S. Morgan. As Richard and Victoria exchanged irritated glances, Thomas added his testimony, explaining his role as an intermediary over the decades. My lawyer then detailed the legal aspects of the literary inheritance. Fascinating, Nathan said sarcastically. But that doesn't change anything about the house or the property. The papers are signed. Are you saying Grandma was rich? Olivia asked, being the first to grasp the full implications. Not in the way you measure wealth, I replied. She never cared about money or status. But yes, the royalties she never touched add up to approximately $5 million. All legally mine now, as the heir to her literary identity. Victoria. Visibly staggered, reaching for support against the nearby wall. $5 million? Impossible. She wore the same dresses for decades. Because she valued other things, I explained. Like the impact of her words, like preserving the history and beauty she loved. Richard, normally so eloquent, was speechless. His face shifted between shades of red and white. Besides the royalties, I continued, unfolding a map on the coffee table. There's also this. Over the years, Grandma used her money to discreetly purchase endangered historical properties in the neighborhood. This house, Thomas's bookstore, and 7 other historic buildings that together make up most of this block. Nathan moved closer to the map, his legal training quickly processing the implications. If this is true, the deal with the developer cannot proceed. I finished. The house won't be torn down, nor will any other historic building on this block. I then played an old recording found among Nora's belongings, her soft voice reading passages from The Silences of the River and discussing revisions with Thomas. Olivia's eyes widened as she recognized her grandmother's voice speaking about characters and scenes from the famous novel. There must be some mistake, Richard finally stammered. Mom wouldn't do this. She wouldn't hide something like this from the family. The family? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. You all barely visited her. You treated her like some irrelevant old woman whose stories were too boring to hear. No wonder she kept her greatest achievement, a secret from people who valued her so little. A heavy silence filled the room. What do you intend to do? Nathan finally asked, his professional tone masking any emotion. Reveal the truth to the literary world. Turn this house into a small museum and literary center dedicated to Nora Morgan's life and work, and establish a foundation to support emerging women writers, especially those facing barriers like the ones Grandma faced. Victoria scoffed. Always the idealist. And what about us? Simply ignored in your grandmother's literary will? Exactly how I was ignored in her material will, I replied. The difference is, I never ignored her while she was alive. A week later, I organized a press conference in Grandma's garden. The rose garden she had tended for decades provided the perfect backdrop. Vibrant, resilient, blooming despite recent neglect. Standing alongside Dr. Chen and representatives from Horizon Press, I announced the true identity of T.S. Morgan and the re-release of all her works under the name Nora Morgan. Journalists from literary publications, local newspapers, and even some national outlets attended, drawn by the extraordinary story of a woman who had fooled the literary world for decades. "Why reveal it now?" asked one journalist. "Why did your grandmother keep the secret even after her death?" Nora Morgan lived in a time when women faced systemic obstacles in the literary world, I replied. Her pseudonym wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. And as for why now, I believe she left that decision to me, knowing I would understand when the time was right. The literary world exploded with the news. Universities, museums, and literary organizations reached out, eager for documents and memorabilia to feature in exhibitions about Nora. One of the greatest literary discoveries of the century, declared the New York Times. Rewriting the American canon, stated The Atlantic. Nora Morgan's house will be transformed into a small museum and literary center, I announced to the cameras, and we're establishing the Nora Morgan Foundation to support early career women writers, especially those facing systemic barriers. In the middle of the crowd, I noticed Olivia watching quietly, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. In the weeks that followed, the house that had nearly been demolished came back to life. Restorers carefully preserved its historical elements while we adapted spaces for exhibits, readings, and workshops. Nora's study was kept exactly as she had left it, a sanctuary for her secret creative life. A month after the press conference, while overseeing the installation of display cases for her original manuscripts, I noticed Olivia standing hesitantly at the entrance. "Can I come in?" she asked, looking strangely vulnerable without her usual influencer confidence. "Of course," I replied, surprised by her visit. Richard and Victoria had moved to Florida 2 weeks earlier, unable to face the embarrassing attention from the local press. Olivia wandered around the space, observing photographs of Nora at different ages, carefully preserved diaries, and first editions of The Silences of the River. "It's beautiful what you're doing here," she finally said. She would have loved it. "Thank you," I replied, still unsure of her intentions. "You probably hate me now," she continued quietly. "Why?" "For being so shallow, for never valuing Grandma, for siding with my parents in that ridiculous will." I sat on one of the benches in the exhibit room, motioning for her to join me. "I don't hate you, Olivia." "You know, I write," she suddenly confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "Mostly poetry. I've never shown anyone. Dad always said it was a waste of time, that I should focus on things that bring money and status." "Grandma would have loved to know that," I said, genuinely surprised. "You think so?" Her eyes lit up. "I always thought she saw me as nothing more than the shallow influencer." Grandma saw beyond appearances. It was her superpower as a writer. I hesitated for a moment. "Would you like me to read something you wrote?" Olivia bit her lip, then slowly nodded. She pulled her phone from her pocket, opened a notes app, and handed it to me. I read the poem on the screen, surprisingly lyrical, and honest verses about family expectations, appearances, and the emptiness of a life lived for the cameras. There was real talent there, hidden beneath years of suffocating expectations. "This is really good, Olivia. Really." Her eyes filled with tears. "No one has ever. I mean, I never thought I could, really." Grandma used to say that stories always find a way to be told, even when the world tries to silence them. I replied, handing the phone back. Maybe it's time for you to find your voice too. In the months that followed, Olivia and I developed a friendship we had never shared before. She began attending the writing workshops at the center, at first anonymously, and eventually found the courage to share her work. Her follower count dropped when she started posting more substantial and personal content, but those who stayed formed a much more genuine community. Nathan eventually came around too, offering free legal services to the foundation, his way of making amends. I always admired Grandma, he confessed during an awkward lunch. I just never knew how to express it in a way Dad would approve of. Richard and Victoria remained distant, occasionally sending cold emails through their attorneys, trying to claim portions of the literary royalties, attempts that were quickly dismissed by the courts. 6 months after the discovery, we officially inaugurated the Morgan House of Literary Arts. The historic neighborhood was now protected. Thomas's bookstore had become part of the foundation, and writers from all over the region found inspiration and support in the spaces Nora had quietly preserved. The Literary Academy began the long process of re-evaluating T.S. Morgan's work, now Nora Morgan, in light of her true identity. New studies, theses, and articles explored the layers of meaning in her writing that had been interpreted differently when everyone believed the author was a man. On the day of the inauguration, Thomas handed me a package carefully wrapped in navy blue fabric. She finished this weeks before she passed, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. She asked me to keep it safe until everything was resolved. It was an unpublished manuscript, Nora's final work, written over several years in complete secrecy. Entitled Currents. The novel returned to the same riverside setting as her first book, but decades later, exploring how younger generations dealt with the secrets and silences left behind by their ancestors. On the dedication page, written in her elegant handwriting, the words made my heart stop. For my Emma, who showed me that true legacy is not in bank vaults, but in the stories we tell and the lives we touch. You have always been the greatest treasure I could have ever wished for. Beside it, an old photograph showed a young Nora with her first manuscript, and on her face, the same quiet determination I now recognize in myself when I look in the mirror. That night, after all the guests had left, I sat alone in Nora's restored study. The soft light of the green-shaded lamp illuminated the unpublished manuscript in front of me. Outside the window, the rose garden shimmered under Charleston's moonlight. Some people spend their entire lives chasing fortune, only to realize that true treasures are hidden as dusty books, waiting for someone curious enough to open them and discover the worlds inside. The family excluded me from the will, but Grandma's journal held much more than $1 million secret. It held the truth about who she was, who I am, and the power of words to transcend time and transform lives. And that, I realized as I opened the first page of Nora's final manuscript, ready to dive into her last words, is the greatest treasure I could ever inherit.